Welcome, everyone, to the Babylonian podcast. I'm your host, Michael Light. If you're a Second Temple Jewish literature junkie or big-time Bible nerd or anywhere on the path to be one like one of us, then Babylonia is the place for you. Here we explore all types of odd ancient texts like the Apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, and more. So with scholars, sages, and the scriptures, let's Bible on. And special news today, starting today, I'm joined by a special guest, Peter. Welcome to Babylonia.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here. My name's Peter, and I'm related to you, and I'm really excited to be here. I like reading a little bit, and I have a lot to learn, so I hope I can have a good time.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm super pumped to do this with you, and we're going to be going through the New Testament Apocrypha, which is, usually in the Babylonian podcast, we're focusing a lot more on Second Temple literature and such. For this series, we're going to be going through the New Testament Apocrypha. So I'm excited to do that with you. And it'll be helpful because you have some church history knowledge. You definitely have more than me. So you can kind of maybe help out there every now and then, which will be nice. But yeah. So that being said, well, Peter, do you have anything else that you would like to share? If not, we can just move forward. But
I mean, I already have a question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. What's the question?
Well, you said okay, that I have a little bit of church history knowledge. I might have a framework for where, what context some of these might have come from or in. And I guess my first question is were the New Testament Apocrypha all written at the same time, or are they something that's kind of spread out throughout a whole lot of, throughout all of post Jesus' ascension history?
Yes, that's a good question. We're going to jump into that, but I guess a short answer is it kind of depends on how you define the New Testament Apocrypha. So, yeah, actually, that's a pretty good starter into getting into what is the New Testament Apocrypha, and really that's what this whole first episode is going to be about. It's going to be about setting expectations for the New Testament Apocrypha. For those of y'all who haven't listened into my last series, we went through the Old Testament Apocrypha, all the Old Testament Apocrypha, and we pretty much went through a summary, a breakdown, and kind of explaining the significance of the Old Testament Apocrypha, how it helps us better understand the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And so with the New Testament Apocrypha, it's similar. It's apocryphal literature, but now it's New Testament Apocrypha. It's written by Christians. So we're going to explore a little bit of what are our expectations going into this, because a new twist on this series is that I am really unfamiliar with the New Testament Apocrypha. Peter and I, both of us, are jumping into this brand new, head first. So I have done a little bit of reading ahead, so I have I know a little bit of what to expect, but yeah, honestly, a lot of it is new, and I'm just unfamiliar with it, so I'm just jumping in head first.
Let's Bible on.
Yeah, let's Bible on. That's good. So with that, I thought we would just look into look at what we expect for the New Testament Apocrypha, especially with the Old Testament Apocrypha in mind, kind of a comparison, but also just a general setting of expectations. So if you've heard of the New Testament Apocrypha, or even if you haven't heard that term, you've probably heard of, well, I don't know, Peter, what are some New Testament, have you heard of any New Testament Apocrypha texts?
I know about Saint Thecla, and I think she's in the Acts of Paul and Saint Thecla. So she's interesting to me. I don't know very much about her, but she interests me. And then I before this, I think you were mentioning that there's some texts that are kind of maybe fake gospel accounts. And I did listen to Wes Huff and Joe Rogan talk a little bit about, what is it, Gospel of Barnabas, or Gospel of Peter, things like that. So I don't know, but I guess if you throw the name of a really famous New Testament person on and put the gospel before it, and it's not in the New Testament canon, it's probably a New Testament Apocrypha. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good explanation of what the New Testament Apocrypha is. But yeah, you're right. Acts of Paul and Thecla, which I haven't read yet, but I have also heard of. All I know is that Thecla is supposed to be his wife, right?
Yeah,
Paul's wife?
I think she's well, I think it's weird. I don't know yet. We'll find out. But
Okay.
I think she has like some connection to celibacy. So she's inspired by his celibacy, but also maybe also his wife, or maybe not. I don't know.
It might be like, I wonder, I mean, yeah, obviously we are going to read that text and get into it and talk about that then. But yeah, I don't know anything about, I've heard the name, and I know that I think Ethiopic Orthodox Church has that text in their canon, but and maybe some other Oriental Orthodox churches. Yeah, that's interesting. You probably, I mean, I'm assuming you've almost certainly heard of the Gospel of Thomas before.
Oh yeah, I think it has like a really sexist part at the end.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it has something about like you have to become a male to enter into the kingdom of God. I have read that one. I read that one for part of my, I can't remember what class or what the assignment was, but I had to do it for maybe a New Testament class for my bachelor's in biblical studies. Gospel of Thomas. You may have also heard of the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which I would say is probably among the top three with those other two, which is different from just the Gospel of Thomas. Gospel of Thomas is just a bunch of sayings, and then infancy Gospel of Thomas, which I actually have read, is just little baby Jesus being a menace. It's pretty much like a 7-year-old Jack running around and like being a punk. So, not, as you can see from these examples, gospel is a very loose term, but either way, so you may have heard of the Gospel Thomas, infancy Gospel Thomas, Gospel Barnabas, Acts of Paul and Thecla, perhaps the Revelation of Peter, which was kind of closer to getting into the canon, and perhaps even the Epistle of Barnabas. Now, this is where this gets a little bit fuzzy, because the Epistle of Barnabas is usually understood to be be part of the text known as the Apostolic Fathers, which you've read.
Yeah, I haven't read all of them, but I have read the Epistle of Barnabas, I think.
Okay, I've read all of them.
That one is, I think that's the one that explores the relationship between like Christianity and Old Testament law, right? Or it tries to.
I can remember. That is the one part that I remember the most. Is it has a very interesting interpretation of the law. So yeah, I guess the first thing is like explaining the Apocrypha. That's the number one thing is defining the Apocrypha. So in my episode introducing the Old Testament Apocrypha, I explained that if you hear the word Apocrypha, then most people are going to think about, oh, these are the books that are considered in the Roman Catholic Bibles, but not in the Protestant Bibles, or the Orthodox Bibles and not the Protestant Bibles. That's usually how a lot of people use the term. But for me, I think it's more helpful to think of the Apocrypha as a more overarching broad category or genre, not really literary genre, but just genre, meta-genre that contains within it different types of genre. And also within the Apocrypha, I would say, I think a helpful way to think of it is pseudepigrapha. And pseudepigrapha comes from, pseudo and graphe in the Greek, which means false writing. So these are writings that are attributed to people who didn't actually write them. So for the Old Testament, you have popular examples like 1 Enoch, Baruch, which is usually considered an apocryphon, or 1 Baruch, 4 Esdras. You have all these that are attributed to people that didn't write them, versus books that wouldn't be pseudepigrapha, but would only be apocrypha, which would be like 1 or 2 Maccabees, which, it's not claiming to be authored by the Maccabees, it's to be about them. So similarly with the New Testament Apocrypha, I guess for me, I think it's helpful to think of it as the Apocrypha is an overarching thing. And when it comes to the New Testament Apocrypha, really all New Testament Apocrypha are New Testament pseudepigrapha at the same time. At least mostly. The names, they're all attributed to these apostles. And so, Thomas, Barnabas, Peter, or maybe not necessarily one of the 12 apostles, but someone around there. Another popular one is the Proto-Evangelium of James. So, some red letter New Testament character. So, I don't know, does that explanation kind of make sense?
Yeah, so I guess a couple questions first. What is a red letter New Testament character?
I used the word red letter. I just meant like a New Testament character. I don't know why I used red letter, but just, that was, it's just because I was thinking of like in the New Testament, when Jesus speaks, it's in red letters in some translations. I don't know why I threw that. That was confusing. Yeah.
Cool. So at the beginning, you were talking about how it's like a genre that has like subgenres. And so the
Mhm.
way I'm thinking about that is I hear, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, but also the Acts of Paul and Saint Thecla, right? One genre might be like someone writing maybe hypothetically like a fan fiction of Jesus and what Jesus was like and what he was doing. One might be trying to create things of what they think Jesus was doing. Like they're not like trying to make stuff up, but they're trying to maybe accurately represent it. And then you've got another genre that's talking about entirely different characters. So one could be fun and what like almost as if you have like comic books and like romance novels in the same, but we're categorizing them not based off of like the content of what's in
Mhm.
them, but we're categorizing them
Mhm.
based off of the fact that they are outside of the New Testament, but they're associated with characters that are inside the New Testament. And those characters could be doing
Mhm.
anything. Is that kind of what you'd say?
Yeah. Are you saying it doesn't matter the medium as much as the content and what it's focusing on and what it's trying to say? Like a
Yeah,
comic book versus what was the other example you gave?
yeah. A comic book versus like a romance novel or something like that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, for me, I think it's helpful to even see it like I guess to take a little bit to take a little bit of the stigma away from the New Testament Apocrypha. And some of the New Testament Apocrypha rightly deserves its stigma, but to take that away and to also put it into more relatable terms, I think it's helpful to think of it, yeah, as like a genre that doesn't depend on the medium. So based on this definition, I would even consider like The Chosen or Risen or these other like contemporary remakes where it's trying to like explain and get into like this is Jesus's story or this is some story about some guy who's exploring the resurrection. I would consider that still within the genre of apocrypha, because in like all we're doing is we're doing the same thing as what these early Christians were doing. It's just we have different media for doing it, if that makes sense.
No, I love that you say that because some Christians might be hesitant to hear about Eden and Peter marrying Eden. She's a character in The Chosen. She's his wife. And
Mm,
they're
mm,
like, well, we don't think that it's necessarily, we're not saying that Eden is the name of Peter's wife. We're not saying, they're not trying to make a big claim. Okay, this is all biblically what happens, but it does help us get like a picture of maybe what Jesus was like and how he interacted with the world. And hopefully, it would be grounded based off of biblical principles. I haven't seen most of The Chosen, but hopefully it would be based off of how the Bible represents Jesus, adding in him in a different story, maybe a fictional story that we're kind of making up. Is that kind of what you're getting at? And then these people are actually writing
yeah,
that, but it's written before. And so we might be tempted to think they're trying to make this statement about Jesus that they might not be trying to make. They're just writing
yeah,
about him.
yeah. That's a really good example. Yeah, and so you have to. I think that's a really good example. Like for The Chosen, for example, you have to watch it and see. Okay, what are the decisions they're making on what to add and what to not emphasize or not include in their television series? Because just if they don't include some story from the Gospels into their stories doesn't mean they don't believe it's canonical. And in the same way, just because they add something doesn't mean they're dogmatically stating that you have to believe this. But for The Chosen, when you watch it, you understand that it's trying to do different things. For example, it's trying to explore like what does it look like in this last season 3 at the time of recording this. There's this whole discussion about Jesus saying like you are Peter and on this rock I will build my church. So it's trying to do a little bit of somewhat theological conversation about that and what that looks like, or like get you into like a more relatable stance with really it seems to me like The Chosen's really trying to help you. This isn't about The Chosen, but just using it as an example, when you watch it, you're kind of like, oh, this is about helping people relate to these characters and see their personal lives and see that Peter's wife has a name and he has struggles with ministry and with his family and all that. So yeah, you have to read it and see. And some of it is just straight up deceptive, right? Just like, is it called The Last Supper? That there's like this like really blasphemous like um I think there's some really blasphemous like recreation of like The Last Supper that's kind of raunchy and stuff. So it's not that all of it is good and everybody, just because they had something to say about the Bible and the New Testament and they were fans, means that it's good. But at the same time, it doesn't mean they're trying to add on to the scriptures. Sure, there are texts that are trying to do that because it is early on. But you also have to see what it's trying to do, if it's trying to add in theological commentary. So yeah, that's good.
Sweet.
Yeah. So, and that actually makes a pretty good segue for talking about genre, because within the New Testament Apocrypha, there are different genre. So again, pretty much all New Testament Apocrypha are pseudepigrapha. They're going to be claiming to be authored by Peter, James, or whoever. They may or may not have actually desired for the people to the readers to believe that it's that person, or it could have been, for example, like The Chosen, where it's just following around these characters and it wants to place you inside of them, right? So, yeah. The New Testament, by the way, the New Testament Apocrypha, we're not going to be going through every single one. If you want to go through like every single New Testament Apocrypha out there, and I think they're finding New Testament Apocrypha, like they're just digging them up maybe every year or couple years, maybe every couple months. But they're continuing to find some. I think it's around the 1800s, especially more 1900s when they started to find more. You can find a lot of these online for free. I used to be using, before I first bought a 2-volume set, I think it was Wilhelmer Shekel, something like that. It was a German translation, and then they made an English version with like fresh translations and then brought over the introductions. But I actually returned that one and changed it in because it just has a bunch of introductions, but it doesn't really have the texts. So that's a warning if you're looking into that. That's one of the most popular ones. The one that we're going to be going through is J.K. Elliott's New Testament Apocrypha, or it's called the Apocryphal New Testament. I'll leave it in the show notes if you're interested. But yeah, the way that he breaks it up into genres is he says that there's Gospels, and he breaks that up into, even smaller than this, but Gospels about Jesus's infancy and his birth. So we're talking about how Jesus came about in his birth and when he was like a young child, which obviously speculation comes from that because we have one story from the Gospel of Luke when Jesus was a 12-year-old. And then other than that, it's like Jesus is 30 and he comes onto the scene and it's like, okay, what happened between that? So that's the birth and infancy Gospels. I've read all of those so far. Then we also have ministry and passion Gospels. The passion is one way to refer to Jesus's suffering, his crucifixion and death. So obviously those are going later on. We have apocryphal Acts, which is obviously based on the Acts of the Apostles, the canonical text, apocryphal epistles, and apocryphal apocalypses. So one important note to make about this is even though obviously these genres, first of all, these genres are based on the canonical genres that we find in the New Testament, right? Gospels, Acts, epistles, and apocalypse. Like they all correspond to that. But at the same time, it's a little bit deceptive because they don't, if you read them side by side, it's not going to be told in the same way. So for example, the Proto-Evangelium of James just goes over a whole span. It's maybe like 10 pages in an English translation. And it goes all the way from Mary's mother giving birth to her to the birth of Jesus. So it's going over all that story in just 10 pages. And when you read it, it doesn't really follow this versus, you think of the canonical Gospels and it's Jesus goes around and Jesus heals people, serves them. Jesus gives parables and teachings. What's that?
It's action-packed.
It's action-packed. Yeah, Jesus is doing things. It's about his ministry, his healing, his speaking and teachings. You can have something like the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas is literally just, these are a bunch of quotes from Jesus that it's just an amalgamation of 117 sayings of Jesus. Or you can have like the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is skipping over all these, all this time, and it's telling like these selected stories from it. When you read it, it's different from the actual text. So just because it has the title Acts or Gospel, it doesn't mean that it's written in the same way as that. But it is definitely based on that. The Gospel stories are biographies of Jesus that are inspired by the canonical Gospels to one extent or another. Same with the Acts and the Apocalypse.
So question that I'm kind of thinking of right now, as you talk about, at the beginning I asked, hey, like what time were the New Testament Apocrypha written? And you're like, well, it kind of depends on how we define it. And now, like, based on what you're describing, like, one, the New Testament Apocrypha could have been written anywhere from hypothetically like 33 AD, probably later than that, to like yesterday. In light of that, there could be a whole number of things. And I'm thinking about like, oh, someone's like recording quotes. Is there a chance that some of that stuff might have actually been said by Jesus that we just don't have now in our like that I wouldn't have in like the four gospels, but like maybe some quote was like recorded and put down and, you know, it's hidden away, but we wouldn't be able to decipher that. Is that kind of how that might work?
Yeah. Like you're saying, could
Like,
some of this
could it have some
apocryphal
lost quotes
material
from Jesus?
contain some truth? Some of it is actually valid.
Well, not just
Yeah.
true. But yeah. Actually, that's exactly it. True in regards to like the historical person of Jesus when he was walking around. Could
Jesus
some of
actually did say this,
Yeah.
or he did do this. Yeah. I mean, we don't have video camera footage, so there's no way to test or prove, but there's a couple things to take in mind. One is a lot of the time scholars are dating these texts based on, what type of language is it using? What are the things that it's focusing on and what's its theological emphases? For example, there is a distinction between, there's like a pretty, and again, I'm not a scholar on this, but there's a distinction to be made between the apostles who are born and raised Jews who had been with Jesus, and they're just assuming all these Jewish things, versus later Christian enthusiasts who are writing, who don't know anything about Jewish practices. And so that can give us a little bit of a clue, especially when it's highlighting only the good sides of things, or it's telling things that are just don't make sense. So I'll give a couple examples. Luckily, I have read a little bit ahead. But one example is the Proto-Evangelium of James. So I'm kind of spoiler alert for the next episode, but now hopefully you'll want to stick around to see it. But in the Proto-Evangelium of James, Mary is like this she's like this pure woman who her mother gave over to the temple, and so she lived in the temple, and she's raised by these priests and fed by angels. And so already you're like, okay, we don't really know of anything like this from Judaism. And then you go on, and eventually after she marries Joseph and she becomes pregnant, there's this part where I think it's Numbers 5, where there's the test of infidelity. Like if a married man and woman, if the woman commits adultery, there's this whole test where she has to drink this water. Pretty much if her husband suspects that she was cheating on him, he can say, hey, I don't trust you. She has to go to the priest and take this water. And there's this whole like ceremony where they make this pronunciation over it. And like she says, if I lied, if I was unfaithful, let this water pretty much be a curse to me. And it makes her thighs swell, if I remember correctly. Well, in the Proto-Evangelium of James, not only does Mary take that water, but Joseph also takes that water. So, when it's off on like historical details like this, you can see like that probably was not written by somebody who actually saw this happen. Or as you know from the Epistle of Barnabas, which we're not going to be talking about because that's usually considered under the Apostolic Fathers. But as you know from the Epistle of Barnabas, it talks about how the Jewish laws that were given at Mount Sinai were actually about these esoteric truths about how to live virtuously. Even these laws about what you can and can't eat and what animals are clean and unclean, those are actually about sexual purity and all these other things. And when you read that and you're like, it seems to me that that's probably not written by Barnabas, the Jewish apostle, So, but we do have scholars who, and again, a lot of these scholars are critical scholars. They're not confessional. They don't have any, they don't really care about, I'm sticking to the Apostles' Creed, or like I have these dogmas that I'm going to stick to. They look at some of the things that they look at is one, is this true? Is this Jewish or is this not Jewish? Like, does this person show that they have a fundamental misunderstanding of the time, the practice, the space? Maybe they're describing trees and types of vegetation or animals that are in the region of where they wrote, like maybe Syria or Asia Minor, but they're writing as if that thing is in Palestine. Anachronisms, wording, and also something is, if it's offensive or it would be hard for the church to accept it, that does add some more validity to it sometimes. So, for example, in John 8, in almost every Bible, we have this story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. And, that would be a pretty scandalous story. Jesus is forgiving this adulterous woman. She's getting away with the punishment. And yeah, it's just hard to make sense of. It just sends it in a different trajectory. And so that's why a lot of people add it into, or that's why a lot of people include that in John 8, even though it kind of disrupts. If you read through the Gospel of John, chapter 7, and then you skip that story and then move on, it actually reads more smoothly. And there are different manuscripts that have that in different places. But those are some examples. Some scholars think, for example, that the Gospel of Thomas does have some actual sayings of Jesus. And of course, there are some where it's like, okay, that's just a Gnostic saying. But yeah, there are a few pieces that we will highlight when we get to specific texts. So far, the Gospel of Thomas is the only one that seems like it might have some actual things that Jesus did. Besides, we do have some fragments that we're going to explore as well that are pretty epic, but they just kind of explore. These are like some minority fragments that tell one short snippet of what Jesus did. Oh.
Sweet. Thanks for sharing that. And so kind of just reflecting back on that, like they're looking for evidence of, hey, this person knows what would happen around the time of Jesus. And if they don't know things that are around the time of Jesus, then what they're writing is probably not a recollection that they got that's accurately the real Jesus. It's them making stuff up, because throughout history, let's say someone in the 1300s is trying to write about, they're writing from, we'll say hypothetically Spain, and they're writing about, the Middle East in the first century, they're going to have a really hard time to like identify that. Or if they like misplace the geography so sweet. Sounds cool.
Yeah. Really good summary of my 5-minute little rant there. So yeah, J.K. Elliott, the editor for the New Testament Apocrypha I'm reading through, in his introduction, he has a pretty good quote. So I'm just going to read this real quick. He says, "The texts included under a title such as the New Testament Apocrypha represent an amorphous and wide-ranging group. Unlike the New Testament, which is distinct and stable and was written over only a short period of time, a collection of apocryphal texts, such as the present one, does not constitute an agreed, settled entity written within a defined timescale. In fact, one noteworthy feature of this literature, possibly because it lacked the sanctity of texts afforded canonical status, is that the contents of its books were frequently revised, expanded, epitomized, and rewritten." So yeah, like you said, this includes a whole lot of texts. There's no qualifications for like, oh, I have to do this for this to be a New Testament Apocrypha. Anybody could have written, well, actually one of the things is there was a much lower literacy rate back then, but at the same time, anybody who had the expensive materials to write a text and anybody who had the education to write could have written a New Testament Apocrypha. And what's going to cause it to flourish more, some of the contributing factors as to whether or not we're going to even receive it today, and still, what I mean by receive is continue to have the texts. What's going to preserve the text and keep it going so that even in the 21st century, we still have it available to us is the popularity and how much people favored it, because some of these people really got hooked on to these apocrypha, and they liked maybe the theological commentary or the fan fiction, the explanations, just like people today with comic books and Chosen fans who can be very, very excited and pushy for the Chosen. It's the same thing. It's kind of based on popularity. If they're going to produce a bunch of copies of the translation, and then it's going to continue to be translated throughout.
So I'm just thinking about this. So the Chosen, right? If we fast forward 1,000 years, and they're looking at what we write about Jesus, that could technically be New Testament Apocrypha to them. And so, like thinking about this, and correct me if I'm wrong, if the Chosen is in there, they'll see that, oh wow, this is what people in the 21st century thought about Jesus. But also included in that might be some people who maybe are less thoughtful, or maybe not even as excited about Jesus himself either. So like a middle schooler just goes ahead and they write a little paper, assuming they write still instead of typing on computers. I don't know, but they write a little paper, and maybe they're joking around. They're like, Jesus is riding a unicorn or whatever. But that's kind of, it would probably feel like, New Testament Apocrypha to them. And so when we look at this, we can very easily, it can be easy for us to maybe come with this bias that everyone's coming at this with like really positive intentions, or maybe that everyone's coming at it with really negative intentions, or that everyone comes with the same knowledge and experience. And maybe it's like easy as well for us to think when we look at the past that everyone if they came before us, if it's written 500 years ago, that's pretty close to Jesus, when in reality there's a huge gap between that person and Jesus in the historical context. So they probably wouldn't be able to accurately depict it. Is that pretty spot on?
Yeah. That's a really good, helpful example. And in fact, if you think about it, the fact that these people are writing under an anonymous name or a pseudonymous name, it makes you wonder, okay, who would write such a thing, right? Well, we don't want to throw out all the way. At the same time, it does make you wonder, okay, how valid is this text really? Also the fact that, yes,
I guess, well, I have a spicy question. Maybe we'll get to that later, but I think it's kind of related to this idea.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so I'll hop into it. So I know that some of the New Testament epistles, we have people who there's some people who will say, okay, this was written by Paul, but it wasn't like, it was written by like someone who's around him, like writing for him was acceptable at that time, but now it's not. Now we can automatically in our minds think, oh, it's a forgery because this person who is near Paul and is writing about it, they're lying and misleading us, but that might be acceptable then, right? At that time.
Okay.
But now when I approach a New Testament Apocrypha, like maybe they don't see it as a problem. Maybe they do. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a spicy question. So you're asking about, say, I don't know the full list, but like maybe Ephesians, I think is in it, Philippians, some of the epistles that scholars doubt whether Paul really wrote them, and say that a later group of Christians in the Pauline school writing as if they were Paul to this said church or whatever. And your question was,
or even like later.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, at that time it could be, oh yeah, I guess there's a difference. There's a difference in the sense of like, because sometimes people say, oh, someone nearby Paul was writing it, right? So like, for example, in Romans, we know that it wasn't like, I don't remember who it says, but there was someone who was like with him who wrote the letter. There was someone who was with him who wrote the letter.
Dictation theory.
What's that called?
I think it's called dictation theory, where it's like, or I think there's some people who say that like, I don't think there's very many people that say that Paul, for example, was dictating word for word, say this, and this, but Paul is giving out his ideas, and it goes through several drafts. Like they take notes on like, okay, these are the different things that we want to go over, and eventually it comes to this final draft. And like you said, in Romans, and I think there's some other Pauline epistles where it talks about another writer who's helping out Paul. So what was your question? I forgot what your question was.
I'm trying to think from the mindset of those of your listeners who they might think, oh, someone else is writing in the name of Paul or the name of this. And naturally they're like, oh, that's a big no-no. But that's because like we currently don't do that in our literature often. Like most books you read, if it says that it was written by Joe Schmo, it was written by Joe Schmo.
Joe Schmo had his hands on the keyboard typing in the letters.
That he was doing that. And it's not, that it's, unacceptable to, it's unacceptable to represent yourself as someone else. But I guess with the New Testament Apocrypha, there's still like, they might have thought it was okay to go ahead and, oh, this is a letter by Paul, Yeah. Maybe.
That's a good point. Versus like the difference. That is a spicy question. So that's like, so you're asking like the person who wrote the Acts of Paul and Thecla, could they think of themselves in the same way as Paul's secretary saw himself as an extension of Paul? Is that your question?
Yeah. Well, I
like, is that for us to redefine, like explain, like for them, like Paul's secretary or the guy who's right, it's not like he had just one secretary, but say Paul's secretary for the book of Romans, maybe today we might think of that more of like an editor for a book who, is taking maybe more of adding in more of his style versus, I don't know, later on somebody saying like, oh, you know, I'm really passionate about people not marrying each other because I think that's Jesus's teaching. And so I'm going to write a letter in Paul's name saying, hey, leave your wives, don't marry anyone, don't have sex, don't eat sweets or meats and stuff like that. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah, like I guess perhaps someone could think, oh, this is just me innocently just writing from the perspective of Paul. And obviously we're generalizing, right? Because this is probably, the New Testament Apocrypha are probably written from a lot of different locations and at a lot of different times. So like we like to say culture at that time, like that's probably pretty general. Like we don't, you mean culture at what time? In the 6th century, in the 4th, in the 17th, you know?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I guess it's somewhat interesting to me. And I guess it is important to be aware that someone might not see it as a big deal to go ahead and write something from the perspective of Paul or John or something like that.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting you bring that up. I think, I think definitely. So actually, I remember even reading in this that one of the Apocrypha, I can't remember if it's one that we're going to go over soon or not, but he was explaining how one early church father, I can't remember the name, actually talks about a specific bishop who wrote in a New Testament pseudepigrapha, a New Testament apocrypha. That's the singular term for an apocrypha or pseudepigrapha. And he wrote it actually so that, I think it was so that people would believe in the resurrection, to kind of like add credibility to the resurrection or some other doctrine. And they actually talked about how he got, I think they say he got removed as bishop or as priest or whatever he was, but they I think they deposed the person. So that's another interesting thing, is that there's a difference between, say, like a church father, right, who's writing in like, oh, this is some tradition that we have and that we believe that Jesus or the apostles did. Not that that means that, okay, a church father said this, that means that that actually happened. But there is a difference between them writing under their own name. They're also in church leadership, probably significantly more studied on the scriptures, taught by other bishops and in league with, you know, these are the people going to synods and ecumenical councils who are, you know, you got to be Orthodox, or you're at least expected to be, versus, you know, Joe Schmo who goes to church and, you know, he's a Bible fan and he's a Jesus fan, but he might have some misconceptions about, you know, I don't know. He might have his own passion about not marrying, not having sex, not eating sweet foods that his priest or bishop didn't want, or he might not even be part of the worldwide Orthodox Church. He might be, you know, we have a famous large collection of texts from the Nag Hammadi library, which is a Gnostic library, uncovered, I think, in the 1940s. So that's where a lot of New Testament Apocrypha come from. We're not going to be, I don't think we're going to be reading a whole lot of those with the collection we have. That's not really, I don't find that very fruitful for understanding the New Testament. And we're just going to be going through the ones in the edition that I have, which does include some, like the Gospel of Thomas, which I don't think is helpful, but it's helpful to, I guess, become aware of what it's about, and it's interesting to protect against it. Yeah. Another quick quote from him on genres. He says, many of the texts have no obvious link with the genres of literature to be found in the canonical New Testament. Many New Testament Apocrypha do not fit sensibly into these categories: Gospel, Acts, Epistles. The Epistle of the Apostles is no real letter as understood in terms of the New Testament epistles. Rather, it is a type of apocalyptic literature better designated as dialogues of the risen Savior. So that goes back to what I was saying about, just because it has the name apocalypse or epistle or gospel or whatever it is, doesn't mean that it's going to fit into, it's going to go along with the style or even the content that we have in our New Testament. Yeah. So another thing, we went over examples of New Testament Apocrypha. I don't have a for sure set list right now, but based on what I've seen ahead from this Apocrypha, it looks like this might be a 45 episode podcast. So we're talking large. Yeah. There's 45 different Apocrypha. Some of them we're grouping together because they're like a page or two. They're super small, but we do plan on going over them, going through a summary, we're only going through stuff that I've read. Yeah. But we talked about this in the Old Testament Apocrypha series as well. But because this is so wide, this is being written by whoever, whatever layman who's going under an anonymous name. It's not unified literature like the Bible is. As Orthodox Christians, lowercase o Orthodox, who subscribe to the Constantinople Creed, we believe the teaching of the church. We believe Orthodox Christian teaching, and we believe that the Bible is one, it's unified, it's all together, and it agrees with itself. Some scholars that don't feel the need to subscribe to the Apostles' Creed or aren't Christian obviously don't care about that and would probably a lot of them argue otherwise. But the New Testament Apocrypha just objectively just disagrees with itself. So there are many of them are even like based on earlier New Testament Apocrypha. So for example, you'll have two for the infancy gospels, because I've already read these. We have like the Proto-Evangelium of James and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And after that, after those earlier infancy gospel narratives, later infancy gospels are taking a lot from those, and they're retelling those stories selectively. They might change around details, but then you'll also have texts that just like fundamentally disagree. Like you'll have some that say Jesus was like light. He didn't weigh anything at all, and he was shining because he's pretty much just a phantom. He's not a real human being. Not only does that just directly contradict the Bible, but that's going to contradict some Orthodox Apocrypha. So when you read the New Testament Apocrypha, like we have it bound together as a codex, but all that means is that this is all similar to itself in that it's fan fiction based on the Gospels, the New Testament, or based on what these anonymous authors thought about the New Testament. And these authors are going to debate with each other in their narratives about whether or not Mary stayed a virgin throughout her whole life, how long Joseph lived, and whether Mary's mother was a virgin or not, things like these. So we should have no expectations that these are actually going to be unified. They weren't even written. There's no purpose of like, oh, I like that Apocrypha, and I think that this should be written with it, and we should have this collected together. There was no, let's have this bound together in a codex. That's the point.
So what they're saying is, when these were written, they were seen as independent texts, right? So
Yes.
no one's saying, I have a New Testament Apocrypha. They just come across this thing, I imagine, in the market or wherever, right? They see this little book and they're like, okay, this is the Epistle of St. Anne, if that's even a text. And then they take that and they're like, okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why I like to talk about it as a collection of texts rather than like a capital A Apocrypha. Because when you say like, oh, this is the capital A Apocrypha of the New Testament, you get the idea of like, this is one thing. This is one book. These go together. And they do kind of go together in the sense that they're inspired by the anonymous author's interpretation of the New Testament. But other than that, and they might be based on, one Apocrypha might be based on another. But other than that, it's like these can totally disagree with each other.
So it's like, if I could make an illustration here, it's like Paw Patrol and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They're both superheroes, but with an entirely different audience in mind, and functionally how the stories develop are different. One can talk about certain things that might not be appropriate for, 4-year-old kid. I don't know how old kids who watch Paw Patrol are, but yeah. So it's something kind of like that. They have in common, well, they're superheroes, right? And in the New Testament Apocrypha have in common, well, this one has people from the New Testament or people who we see is close to the New Testament, like Thecla or Eden, who aren't mentioned explicitly and may not, or did exist. I don't know. I'm not going to make it. Peter had a wife.
Yeah. Or maybe like, if you think of it like in historical terms, maybe in 2000 years, some weird guy for some reason still has a DVD player and he finds like a movie collection that has the Marvel Spider-Man, the 3 different remakes. And he tries to watch all of them and he's like, wait, why are these like disagreeing with each other? Like, why does one Spider-Man have a 20-year-old aunt and then why does one of them have a 90-year-old aunt? It's like, these are just different. And, the New Testament Apocrypha is even more different between a 90-year-old and 20-year-old Aunt May. But yeah, that's a good explanation for that.
I like your Spider-Man one too.
Yeah. So totally not unified literature. As for the purpose, like we talked about, the purpose of the New Testament Apocrypha is manifold. It could be for the earlier apocryphas. For the earlier apocrypha, a lot of them very well may have wanted to actually inject themselves into the canon. These sly laymen probably thought that they could actually had a chance at getting into the canonical set. Some of them may have expected that. Just because it's early doesn't mean they expected that, though. Some of them might be to supplement scripture. Like, I've always been curious about what happened when Jesus was a child, or what Jesus was talking about with the different religious leaders when he was 12 years old and the questions he was asking. They might also be smoothing over tricky sections from the New Testament. Like, I kind of don't like that Jesus called the Canaanite woman, kind of referred to the Canaanite woman as a dog. That makes me feel uncomfortable. So I'm just going to kind of smooth over that story, kind of I don't like how, Paul rebuked Peter in Galatians, or how he talks about rebuking Peter in Galatians. So I'm going to just smooth it out, do a PR stunt. There might be some of that, explanations, apologetic. There's, especially from what I've seen in the infancy gospels, there's a lot of apologetics for like, Mary was a virgin, which, is good regarding Jesus's birth. Yeah. Anyways, there are also some problems with the New Testament Apocrypha. Other than what we've already talked about, a couple things to keep account for. One, they're New Testament Apocrypha being uncovered today. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know how many New Testament Apocrypha we don't even have. There are church fathers that talk about New Testament Apocrypha that we have never even found. And church fathers also might refer to Apocrypha that we think go by the same name. Like, for example, Cyril of Alexandria may say, we have this Gospel of Thomas that is not part of the canon, but we like and is helpful for understanding the New Testament, which he doesn't say, by the way, but I'm just giving an example. But Cyril of Alexandria may have a different text in mind than what we have in mind. And, it can be difficult thinking, is he talking about the infancy Gospel of Thomas, or is he talking about the just straight up Gospel of Thomas? So there's a couple of different problems with that. It can be difficult trying to figure out, some of these are going to be what's called a composite text. So it's multiple different texts that are kind of like stitched together and made into one text. So there's all types of different problems that we run into when we get to the Apocrypha. So we'll be talking about those when we get to those respective Apocrypha, but there are, we're dealing with ancient, some of these texts are 1,500 years old, maybe even more, maybe a little bit less, but even 1,000 years old, that's significant. That's a long time. So yeah, that's most what we're going to be talking about. But when we go over each Apocrypha, what we're going to try and do, we're going to go through first a little bit of the background of the Apocryphon. We're going to go over where scholars think the Apocryphon was written, by what Christian sect the Apocryphon was written by. We're going to go over who the author claims to be, different names given to the Apocryphon, the date when authors think that it was written, and church fathers who may have referenced the Apocryphon. And then we're going to get into a summary of these Apocrypha. We can't go in depth on everything, but I'm going to try and pick out sections of the Apocrypha that are trying to make a point or that we find interesting. And then we're also going to do something that I'm pretty excited for, that we're going to call, one of these things we're going to call the Orthodoxy Index. So the Orthodoxy Index, Peter, do you want to explain it? I can explain it, but do you want to explain it?
So the Orthodoxy Index is just our subjective rating of how orthodox this book is. So we could say it's 100%, meaning I guess we're defining 100% as it should be in the canon. Like, if you don't believe this, you're not a Christian. And then, 50% being like, okay, this is saying things that are true or interesting, but there's also some things that are a little bit scary here that probably Orthodox Christians should not believe. And then there's like the ones that are like 0. I don't know how you would get to 0%. You would have to only say wrong things, but please be charitable with us, because we're trying to make general, vague, okay, I think maybe this percent or that percent, and maybe sometimes we'll feel a little bit more spicy on other days than others,
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. Yeah, it might be kind of awkward if we run into an anonymous author of these apocrypha and, they were looking down on us from paradise, seeing us giving them like a 60% rating on their apocryphon. But I guess we'll have to see about that one. But yeah, that's just a real fun. If you as a listener are interested in reading the more orthodox ones, then we can give you our suggestions. You can go based on that if you want. I mean, you'll also have a summary and know quite a bit about it already, which will be nice. But we're also going to be, recommending different apocrypha based on whether you're looking for something interesting, not necessarily true, or most heretical if you're looking to read something to just, I don't know, just amaze you at how wrong somebody could be, something like that.
Could I give another benefit that I think is valuable? Yeah. I think this is worthwhile to like learn about history. One way that we learn about history is you start thinking about, hey, this is how people thought. And the way they thought was different than me. So Shepherd of Hermas, whenever I was reading, I didn't finish it, but I read a huge chunk of it. When I was reading Shepherd of Hermas, I like noticed, okay, this person, whoever's writing this, they think in terms that are a lot less individualistic than me. They see themselves like someone's like could be challenged or convicted morally on the grounds not of their own sin, but on the sin of, in the case of Hermas, right, or Shepherd of Hermas, like his family. And so I think it's really interesting and valuable as people who exist in a context to realize there's people who exist in other historical, cultural contexts, and to think about, what might their experiences be like. And then it might paint a different picture of what Christianity looked like at that time as well. And I think that could be really valuable for shaping us, especially if we believe as Christians that the body of Christ is diverse, right? There are ears and eyes and such. I don't think we normally think of that in like a historical sense, but that there are eyes to our ears. So we need those eyes, and those are valuable. And I'm referencing 1 Corinthians 12 for anyone who's curious.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah, I think that's a good point. We're going to try really hard to be charitable. We're going to make this interesting. We're going to make this fun, of course, but we want to be charitable to these authors. Like we noted, both of us are laymen, but these authors are also laymen. They're not church fathers and bishops, and they represent more of the everyday church person rather than, St. Augustine or St. Origen. So when we read these, that's another value of the New Testament Apocrypha is, while it may not have the Jewish insights that, say, the Old Testament Apocrypha has for the Old Testament, the New Testament Apocrypha gives us an idea of, this is kind of how these people thought about the New Testament, about Christianity, about the Christian life. And there's going to be ethical teaching in it as well. Like, what do they emphasize and see as important? So yeah, there's value in that as well. And we're going to try and be valuable, charitable, and bring that out for y'all. Do you have something? Yeah, that's good. Loving our chronological neighbors as well. Who knows how they'll judge us based on like our screwed up historical, even what scholars think it was like back then. So yeah, that's good. Well, in the next episode, what are we talking about in the next episode? The next episode, we are going to be beginning with the lost gospels. Specifically, we're going to be going over lost Jewish Christian gospels, the gospel of the Hebrews, the Nazarenes, the Ebionites, and the Egyptians. I'm excited for that one. But until then, see y'all in Babylonia.